It was late May in 1942 when things began to move quickly at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The wall clock in Admiral Chester Nimitz's command center showed 8 o'clock in the morning as Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton walked in carrying a folder. What sat inside those pages was intelligence so detailed, so extraordinarily precise, that it would have sounded utterly fantastical to anyone not standing in that very room. "The Japanese fleet is heading toward Midway," Layton said straightforwardly. "They'll come from the northwest, approaching on bearing 325 degrees. We're looking at spotting them roughly 175 miles out from the island. The battle kicks off at 7 in the morning on June 4th. Nimitz absorbed this calmly, the kind of steady composure that had earned him his reputation as one of America's most dependable commanders. "So you're saying you've got Yamamoto's exact location pinpointed? You know precisely when he'll show up, and you understand his entire strategy?" "Absolutely correct, sir," Layton responded. "Every directive, every position update, every transmission passing between Japanese commanders, we can read it all. Their complete operational plan is right here in front of us." The room went completely silent. In that instant, Nimitz grasped something profound. The United States Navy possessed something far more lethal than any battleship, far more destructive than any bomb. America had cracked Japan's most confidential communications. What neither man fully appreciated at that moment was how far back this achievement truly reached back, through 2 full decades of relentless, meticulous work. This breakthrough in code breaking hadn't materialized suddenly out of nowhere. It represented the payoff from years of groundwork, complex mathematical brilliance, and the persistent labor of specialists toiling in obscure basement rooms, nowhere near combat zones. The information Layton was presenting to Nimitz would make it possible for him to construct a trap so flawless, so meticulously planned, that future generations of historians would describe the upcoming engagement as perhaps the most significant naval battle in all of American military history. Yet this story didn't really start with the crisis of 1942. The narrative of how America unlocked the capacity to intercept and understand Japanese naval messages traces back considerably further, originating in the modest corridors where small groups of language specialists and mathematical minds operated. These visionaries saw the approach of conflict years before the first explosions at Pearl Harbor. The roots grew from the early 1920s when a far-sighted naval officer named Lawrence Safford recognized a fundamental truth about future warfare. Combat would not be decided merely through cannons and naval vessels, but through the control of information itself. Safford, destined to become recognized as the architect of Navy cryptology, launched the Navy's inaugural systematic code-breaking operation back in 1924. The start was quite humble. A small collection of naval officers armed with little more than pencils and notepads, working to decode the private and strategic messages transmitted by countries that might one day become enemies. Yet Safford possessed strategic foresight. He recognized that Japan, emerging as a powerful force in the Pacific region, would eventually represent a direct challenge to American power and territorial interests. He started bringing together people with specialized abilities, linguists with personal experience living on Japanese soil, mathematicians capable of discovering structure buried within seemingly random sequences, radio specialists with the skill to capture and isolate signals from the electromagnetic chaos. Throughout the 1930s, the Navy positioned listening posts throughout the vast Pacific territories. There existed one positioned at Pearl Harbor on Hawaii's coast. Another facility operated at Cavite in Philippine territory. A third group worked from the nation's capital in Washington. These scattered listening stations would eventually comprise the foundation supporting America's complete intelligence-gathering apparatus for radio transmissions. Joseph Rochefort emerged as one of Safford's most promising recruits, and his trajectory would become inseparably linked with the eventual cracking of Japanese naval encryption. Rochefort had signed up with the Navy back in 1918, just 17 years of age, having misrepresented his age to join during the earlier world conflict. He demonstrated an almost immediate aptitude for languages and for untangling complex puzzles. His commanding officers took notice immediately. Rather than placing him aboard a ship, they positioned him within the Code and Signal Department in Washington. Working within the Navy's primitive cryptographic division, Rochefort recognized he had discovered his true professional purpose. The Navy sent Rochefort to Tokyo in 1929 to become fluent in Japanese. For roughly 3 years, he remained in Japan, absorbing not merely vocabulary, but the deeper culture, the military hierarchy, and the characteristic patterns through which Japanese military personnel expressed themselves in writing. During this Japanese posting, Rochefort encountered another young officer destined to become vital in the impending conflict. That officer was Edwin Layton. These two developed a strong partnership grounded in their shared intellectual obsession with everything Japan, and their shared certainty that fluency in the adversary's communication methods and cultural consciousness would prove absolutely vital when hostilities came. Japan introduced its most advanced naval encryption system on June 1, 1939. American cryptanalysts assigned it the code designation JN25. JN represented Japanese Navy straightforwardly. The figure 25 signified this was the 25th distinct Japanese naval communications system that American specialists had catalogued. This was not a straightforward code where letters simply substituted for other letters. JN25 functioned as an encrypted code, requiring 2 separate transformations that combined to make it extraordinarily resistant to decryption. First, message handlers would reference a lexicon containing approximately 33,000 separate words and phrases. Any word or phrase would receive representation as a sequence of 5 digits. However, Japanese communications personnel never sent these sequences directly over the airwaves. They incorporated a further security layer by employing numerical addition tables. The communications specialist would take that 5-digit code sequence, then combine it with an alternative 5-digit number obtained from a separate reference book, yielding a completely different 5-digit sequence that appeared entirely unrelated to the starting code. This numerical addition shifted repeatedly, sometimes changing every handful of months. Breaking the Japanese message required American analysts to perform 2 steps. First, they had to identify and subtract the numerical addition. Following that subtraction, they had to match resulting numbers to their actual definitions, utilizing the codebook itself. By late 1940, American and British specialists collaborating on cryptanalysis had made meaningful headway against JN25. They understood how the encryption system operated. They had recovered perhaps 1/10 of the code values, somewhere in the region of 3,800 out of 33,000. However, their advancement moved forward with agonizing slowness. Operating with a limited corps of specialists and with relatively few intercepted communications to examine, achieving comprehensive understanding of the code seemed like an ambition that might take several more years. Then came December 1, 1940, when Japan implemented a sweeping transformation. They unveiled an entirely new codebook, which crypt analysts would subsequently name JN25B. Every single code group value had been transformed. The analysts confronted a reset, compelled to patiently reassemble their accumulated knowledge again, hunting down code meanings in a methodical manner through investigation of transmission patterns, through deduction about likely phrases, through creative analytical reasoning. By October 1941, genuine progress was happening again. Approximately 1,500 code groups had been reconstructed. Optimism was building that when spring arrived, they might start reading recent transmissions with useful accuracy. That optimism received a shock on December 4, 1941. A mere trio of days before the Japanese air assault on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese rolled out revised edition tables under a new designation, Edition 8. Though not as severe as a complete overhaul of the encryption lexicon, this innovation signified that crypt analysts faced a challenging recovery process to identify the fresh additions before current transmissions became comprehensible. The recovery timeline would stretch into weeks. When Japanese warplanes descended upon Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the cryptanalysts absorbed the attack as a personal embarrassment. They had dedicated more than 2 full years to studying JN25. If their penetration of the code had progressed further, if the December 4th edition alteration hadn't temporarily blocked them, couldn't they have noticed clues pointing toward that approaching strike force? This question haunted them deeply, particularly Joseph Rochefort, who had assumed management of Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor During June 1941, a remarkable metamorphosis commenced in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters, situated at Pearl Harbor. The structure itself was an ordinary concrete building, positioned adjacent to the submarine facility, the kind of structure that didn't draw any particular attention from passing observers. Descending the basement stairwell, traversing past protective barriers, revealed a chamber that would become the center of everything regarding the Pacific conflict. Station Hypo occupied 60 feet of underground space, devoid of windows, illuminated by intense artificial lighting that produced a perpetual electrical hum. The mechanical cooling system battled continuously against the oppressive temperature created by massive IBM computational machines and the accumulated body warmth of numerous personnel laboring throughout extended shifts. This basement chamber became the headquarters for Rochefort's operation. Rochefort himself was an unconventional commanding officer by practically any standard one could employ. He frequently persisted through 72-hour stretches without exiting the subterranean workspace. He preferred working clothes like smoking jackets and house slippers, since the chilled environment made ordinary garments uncomfortable during nighttime operations. He would skip shaving for days on end. He consumed cigarettes continuously and coffee in seemingly unlimited quantities. Yet he demanded rigorous standards from those around him and from himself. He had personally recruited many of his core personnel. Thomas Dyer comprised his leadership team, a cryptanalysis specialist of exceptional capability who contributed meaningfully to defeating JN25 and who had engineered innovative methodologies for processing encoded material through IBM systems. Alva Laswell represented another key member, a language specialist trained in Tokyo with sophisticated comprehension of the particular phraseology appearing in military transmissions. Hamwright stood out as another valuable cryptanalyst who partnered with Dyer, focusing on the most elusive code elements. Joseph Finnegan possessed mathematical expertise, particularly in analyzing date and time indicators. Beyond these core personnel, Rochefort had assembled numerous enlisted workers, including numerous band musicians originating from the USS California, a vessel that went down during the Pearl Harbor bombardment. These musicians possessed nowhere else to report, consequently receiving assignment to Station Hypo. Numerous musicians demonstrated unexpected proficiency with the demanding analytical and computational thinking required for cryptanalysis. Rochefort maintained conviction that persons trained to interpret musical notation possessed innate talent for recognizing patterns. The very capacity required for identifying recurrent numerical formations within encrypted communication. The actual labor involved unrelenting tedium of extraordinary proportions. An intercepted transmission might contain 205 discrete groups of numerals. Every individual group demanded thorough processing. The analyst would initially attempt to strip away the numerical addition, if that particular addition had already been determined. Subsequently, they would attempt to match the resulting group to an actual definition. With 33,000 potential options, and perhaps several hundred identified during early 1942, the overwhelming majority of any intercepted message would stay meaningless gibberish. However, occasionally fortune would provide something useful. Perhaps they'd identify a naval vessel's designation in one spot, a geographic reference somewhere else, possibly a calendar date, though these required breaking through yet another security layer. From these scattered fragments, the specialists would attempt synthesizing coherent interpretation, identifying which vessels were mentioned, determining their projected destinations, calculating expected arrival times. Traffic analysis played an essential role in supplementing these gaps in understanding. Even without successfully decoding messages, significant information could be derived from examining which stations were transmitting, receiving frequency patterns, and transmission originating points. Whenever radio transmissions proliferated dramatically between certain installations, that pattern indicated an operation was taking form. When a vessel's transmission code went silent, that suggested the ship was maintaining silence to avoid detection, likely because it was advancing toward a goal. Progress came gradually, beginning in late December 1941. Shortly following Pearl Harbor's destruction, specialists working at Station Cast in the Philippines accomplished preliminary breakthroughs against the fresh edition configuration. They distributed their conclusions to hypo and to codebreakers stationed in Washington. The collaboration between these separate facilities became indispensable, though bureaucratic friction would eventually develop. By January 1942, Rochefort's personnel were successfully decoding segments of JN25B. Incomplete messages, perhaps one comprehensible word out of every 5 presented. Yet this partial comprehension was sufficient to start grasping Japanese strategic intentions. They determined that the Japanese were scheduling significant operations throughout the Pacific southern regions. During February, they identified preparations being made for an assault on Port Moresby in the New Guinea region. Through March and April, as Japanese military columns expanded throughout Southeast Asian territories and the East Indies, the cryptanalysts documented movements with precision, providing Admiral Nimitz with intelligence enabling him to maneuver naval assets into optimal positions. The demands were unrelenting and exhausting. Rochefort and Dyer performed rotating 24-hour command responsibilities that regularly stretched toward 36 or even 48 hours without interruption. That subterranean chamber became their existence. Meals happened there, rest occurred on cots positioned there, work consumed them until consciousness seemed to evaporate. When sleep did finally come, they frequently found themselves dreaming in sequences of 5-digit numbers. The computational machines produced unending noise, processing punch card representations, searching for numerical sequences and structures. While the machines accomplished processing in mere hours what would consume human workers for extended periods, the machines possessed limitations. They identified patterns only. Genuine human reasoning remained indispensable for extracting useful intelligence from patterns, for producing the intellectual intuitions distinguishing actual findings from misleading signals. By April 1942, Hypo was successfully deciphering roughly 20% of JN25B communications. This represented remarkable advancement, accomplished within just 4 months. More significantly, they were translating the correct portions. They had recovered code sequences signifying ship classifications, identifying specific locations, representing military divisions, and capturing language conventions found within operational directives. Messages addressing imminent military operations regularly contained sufficient readable portions that analysts could determine purpose, location, and projected timing, despite significant sections of messages remaining incomprehensible. This was circumstances in late April 1942 when specialists started discovering references to an enormous operation scheduled for the initial days of June. The operation's target bore a code designation that emerged repeatedly through the intercepted messages, AF. This raised a straightforward yet fundamentally important question for everyone involved. What location did AF represent? The cryptanalysts had determined that messages employing the designation A seemed to reference locations situated in or around the Hawaiian archipelago. They had previously seen AH used for the island of Oahu. Could AF indicate another Hawaiian location? Simple geography and strategic logic recommended Midway a potential target. The remote atoll lay 1,000 miles from Honolulu, positioned at the terminus of the Hawaiian chain. Its geography held genuine strategic value. Should the Japanese seize Midway, they would establish a forward operational position from which they might threaten Hawaii itself. Yet alternative interpretations competed for credibility among other analysts, most prominently those based in the Washington command structure. Certain specialists believed AF signified Johnston Island, perhaps even representing the Aleutian Islands extending northward into Alaska. Some pushed theories that the Japanese intended further southern movements directed at Fiji or locations like Samoa. Admiral Ernest King, occupying the chief position within the American fleet's Washington headquarters, harbored reservations. He had never entirely trusted Rochefort, regarding him as someone who disregarded proper authority channels, since he frequently communicated directly with Nimitz through Leighton, circumventing standard hierarchies. Rochefort faced requirements to produce corroboration. An error would prove disastrous. If Nimitz distributed his restricted carrier capacity toward defending Midway while the Japanese attacked somewhere else, the ramifications would be devastating. The American Navy controlled merely 3 functioning carriers throughout the Pacific Theater. Enterprise and Hornet remained mechanically sound. Yorktown suffered extensive destruction during the Coral Sea battle occurring in the initial days of May and was making a crippled return toward Pearl Harbor. These three faced Japanese opposition of at least 6 carriers, comprising the 4 vessels that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, directing Japan's complete naval force, had never experienced a military defeat on the ocean. His personnel possessed extensive experience, superior morale, and had maintained a winning record for half a year. A miscalculation from Nimitz could lead to destruction of America's complete carrier fleet. Everything in the Pacific would essentially be finished before genuine conflict truly started. The question whether AF indicated Midway held the key to the Pacific War's entire future trajectory. During the middle portions of May 1942, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, operating within Rochefort's organization, conceived a particularly ingenious strategy. Considering the possibility that the Japanese were monitoring American radio broadcasts, and supposing AF truly designated Midway, perhaps they could manipulate the Japanese through false transmissions into confirming this interpretation. What Holmes proposed was deceptively straightforward but extraordinarily creative. Midway would send an uncoated radio message, one the Japanese could easily intercept, reporting a mechanical problem. Something specific enough to be believable, urgent enough that the Japanese might report it in their own coded traffic. Rochefort took the idea to Leighton. Leighton presented it to Nimitz. Nimitz approved immediately. On May 19th, Nimitz sent a message to the commanding officer at Midway via submarine cable, a communication line the Japanese could not intercept. The message instructed Midway to broadcast in plain language, with no encryption, that the island's water distillation plant had broken down and they urgently needed fresh water supplies. On May 20th, the message went out from Midway. Rochefort and his team waited anxiously. Would the Japanese take the bait? 2 days later, on May 22nd, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence message sent from Tokyo to multiple commands. It stated that AF was reporting a water shortage and would need to transport additional water for the upcoming operation. The room erupted in controlled celebration. AF was Midway. There was no doubt now. Rochefort immediately sent word to Leighton. Leighton briefed Nimitz that same day. The commander of the Pacific Fleet now knew with certainty where the Japanese would strike, but knowing the target was only the first piece of the puzzle. Nimitz needed to know when the attack would come, and in what strength. Through the last week of May, Hypo worked around the clock. Every intercepted message was attacked with desperate intensity. They needed the date. Finnegan focused on the super-enciphered date-time groups, the most secure part of the Japanese system. He searched through thousands of messages, looking for patterns in how the Japanese encoded dates. On May 25th, he found the key. It was a brilliant piece of cryptanalysis that would allow them to read the timing of Japanese operations. The team immediately began processing the backlog of messages about the AF operation. On May 26th, the picture became clear. The Japanese were assembling a massive force: 4 carriers, 2 battleships, numerous cruisers and destroyers. An invasion force with troops to occupy Midway after the airstrike, a submarine cordon to intercept American reinforcements, and a diversionary force that would strike the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north. The main strike against Midway would come in the first week of June, most likely June 4th or 5th. The attack would come from the northwest, approaching Midway at dawn to launch their aircraft. On the morning of May 27, 1942, as USS Yorktown entered Pearl Harbor, bearing the visible scars of battle from Coral Sea, Edwin Leighton walked into Nimitz's office for the daily intelligence briefing. What he was about to reveal to the Admiral would seem almost impossible to believe. The intelligence from Station Hypo was so precise, so remarkably detailed, that it included not just the target and the timing, but the exact bearing from which the Japanese would approach, the approximate distance at which they would launch their aircraft, and even the estimated time when the first planes would strike. Leighton laid out his prediction with quiet confidence. The Japanese would approach from bearing 325 degrees at approximately 175 miles from Midway. The attack would commence around Zulu 700 hours on June 4th. This wasn't conjecture or educated guessing. This was reading directly from the enemy's own operational orders, decrypted and translated by the brilliant minds at Station Hypo. Nimitz listened with complete attention. He asked pointed questions about how certain they could be. Leighton answered without hesitation. This wasn't analysis or interpretation. This was the enemy's own plan, laid bare in their coded messages. Nimitz made his decision without delay. He would position his carriers northwest of Midway, where they could strike the approaching Japanese force with devastating surprise. The Japanese had no idea that American codebreakers had cracked JN25. They expected to achieve surprise. Instead, they would walk into an ambush. But Nimitz faced a serious problem. USS Yorktown, damaged at the Coral Sea, sat in dry dock at Pearl Harbor undergoing repairs. Navy inspectors had estimated the carrier would require 3 months of work before she could return to active service. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. He needed every available carrier for the battle ahead. 1,400 civilian workers from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard descended on Yorktown. They worked relentlessly, cutting and welding, replacing damaged sections, patching holes torn open by enemy ordnance. The shipyard implemented rolling electrical blackouts across Oahu to divert power to the welding equipment. 72 hours after Yorktown entered dry dock, she steamed out of Pearl Harbor, repair crews still aboard, racing to join the task force assembling north of Midway. On June 3, 1942, American patrol aircraft spotted Japanese ships approaching from the west. On the morning of June 4, exactly as Leighton had predicted, radar operators on Midway detected aircraft approaching from the northwest. At 00:07:02 hours, just 2 minutes after Leighton's predicted time, Japanese aircraft struck Midway. But the American carriers were not at Pearl Harbor as the Japanese had expected. They were positioned northeast of Midway, waiting. When Nimitz received the first contact reports that morning, he remarked to Leighton that his prediction had been off by only 5 minutes, 5 degrees and 5 miles. It was one of the most accurate pieces of tactical intelligence in naval history. The Battle of Midway raged from June 4 through June 7, 1942. American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with their aircraft being rearmed on deck. Within minutes, all 3 were burning and would later sink. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown, but American aircraft found and destroyed Hiryu that afternoon. In exchange for Yorktown and the destroyer USS Hammond, which was torpedoed while assisting the damaged carrier, the United States Navy had sunk all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. The Japanese lost approximately 290 aircraft and 357 men. The Americans lost 145 aircraft and 307 men. More importantly, Japan lost 4 experienced carrier crews, pilots and mechanics, and support personnel who could not be replaced. The Japanese Navy would never again achieve the striking power it possessed before Midway. The intelligence advantage did not end at Midway. Station Hypo continued breaking JN25 throughout the war. Japanese commanders never realized their codes had been compromised. They continued using JN25, periodically changing additives and codebooks, but the crypt analysts kept pace with each change. The intelligence derived from JN25, given the code name Ultra, shaped every major American operation in the Pacific. When Japanese forces moved, American commanders knew in advance. When Japanese convoys sailed, American submarines waited along their routes. When Japanese aircraft deployed to new bases, American bombers knew where to strike. One of the most dramatic uses of ultra-intelligence came in April 1943. American crypt analysts decoded a message revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The message provided his exact route and timing. Admiral Nimitz ordered an interception. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal flew 500 miles to intercept Yamamoto's transport. They arrived exactly on time, exactly on course, and shot down both Japanese aircraft. Yamamoto died in the jungle of Bougainville. The operation succeeded because American crypt analysts could read the Japanese Navy's most secure communications. It was Operation Vengeance, and it demonstrated the power of signals intelligence to change the course of war. The intelligence triumph at Midway nearly ended in disaster 1 month after the battle. On June 7, 1942, the Chicago Tribune published a front-page story by reporter Stanley Johnston titled, "Navy Had Word of Jap Plan to Strike at Sea." The article strongly implied that the Navy had advanced knowledge of the Japanese battle plan through code-breaking. Johnston had been aboard USS Lexington during the Battle of the Coral Sea and had seen classified dispatches. His article came dangerously close to revealing that American cryptanalysts could read Japanese codes. President Roosevelt and Navy Secretary Frank Knox were furious. They demanded Johnston be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. A grand jury investigated but declined to indict. Fortunately, the Japanese either didn't see the article or didn't understand its implications. They continued using JN25, never suspecting it had been compromised. The foundation was laid in the early 1920s when a young naval officer named Lawrence Safford recognized that future wars would be fought not just with guns and ships, but with information. Safford, who would later be called the father of Navy cryptology, established the Navy's first organized code-breaking unit in 1924. It was a modest beginning. Just a handful of officers working with pencil and paper, trying to understand the diplomatic and military communications of potential adversaries. But Safford understood that Japan, rising as a Pacific power, would eventually challenge American interests. He began recruiting men with unique talents: linguists who had lived in Japan, mathematicians who could see patterns in chaos, radio operators who could pluck signals from the air. By the early 1930s, the Navy had established intercept stations across the Pacific. One at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, another at Cavite in the Philippines, a third worked from Washington. These stations would eventually form the backbone of America's signals intelligence network. Among the young officers Safford recruited was Joseph Rochefort, a man whose career would become inseparable from the breaking of Japanese codes. Rochefort had joined the Navy in 1918 at age 17, lying about his age to enlist during World War I. He showed an immediate talent for languages and puzzles. His superiors noticed. Instead of sending him to sea, they assigned him to the Code and Signal section in Washington. There, working with the Navy's earliest cryptographic efforts, Rochefort discovered his calling. In 1929, the Navy sent Rochefort to Tokyo to master the Japanese language. For 3 years he lived in Japan, studying not just the language, but the culture, the military structure, the way Japanese officers thought and communicated. It was during this assignment that Rochefort met another young officer who would prove crucial to the coming war, Edwin Layton. The two men formed a friendship based on their shared fascination with Japan and their conviction that understanding the enemy's language and culture would be essential in any future conflict. The Japanese introduced their most sophisticated naval code on June 1, 1939. American cryptanalysts gave it the designation JN25. JN simply meant Japanese Navy. The 25 indicated it was the 25th Japanese naval system the Americans had identified. This was no simple substitution cipher. JN25 was an enciphered code, a two-step system that made it extraordinarily difficult to break. First, Japanese operators would look up words and phrases in a codebook containing approximately 33,000 entries. Each word or phrase was represented by a 5-digit number group, but the Japanese didn't transmit these numbers directly. They added a second layer of security by using additive tables. The operator would take the 5-digit code group, then add another 5-digit number from a separate book, creating a third 5-digit group that bore no obvious relationship to the original. This additive changed regularly, sometimes as often as every few months. To read a message, American cryptanalysts had to strip away the additive, then match the resulting code groups to their meanings in the codebook. By late 1940, American and British cryptanalysts working together had made progress against JN25. They understood the structure of the system. They had identified perhaps 10% of code groups, approximately 3,800 out of 33,000. But their work was painstakingly slow, with only a handful of analysts and limited intercepts to work with. Full penetration of the code seemed years away. Then, on December 1, 1940, the Japanese introduced a major change. They implemented an entirely new codebook, which cryptanalysts later designated JN25B. Every code group meaning had changed. The cryptanalysts had to start over. They began the slow work of rebuilding their knowledge, identifying code groups one by one through traffic analysis, through guessing at common phrases, through brilliant deductive work. By October 1941, they were making progress again. Perhaps 1,500 code groups had been recovered. Hopes were rising that by the following spring, they might be reading current traffic with reasonable comprehension. Those hopes suffered a setback on December 4, 1941. Just 3 days before the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese changed their additive tables to a new system. While this was not as catastrophic as a complete codebook change, it still meant the cryptanalysts had to recover the new additives before they could read messages. The process would take weeks. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the code breakers felt the attack as a personal failure. They had been working on JN25 for 2 years. If they had achieved better penetration earlier, if the December 4th additive change hadn't temporarily blinded them, might they have detected some indication of the approaching attack force? The question would haunt them, particularly Joseph Rochefort, who had been assigned to take command of Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor in June 1941. In the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, a transformation began. The lower levels of this nondescript concrete structure sat near the submarine base, an unremarkable building that few people paid attention to. In its basement, down a narrow stairway, past security checkpoints, was a room that would become the nerve center of the Pacific War. Station Hypo. 60 feet long, windowless, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the heat generated by IBM tabulating machines and the bodies of dozens of analysts working around the clock. This was where Joseph Rochefort and his team would wage their war against the Japanese cipher. Rochefort was an eccentric commander by any standard. The basement became his entire world. 72-hour stretches without stepping outside blurred one day into the next. The air conditioning that kept the space ice cold forced him to slip on a smoking jacket and slippers just to function through the night hours. His face grew darker with stubble. Days passed without a razor touching his chin. Chain smoking became as natural as breathing. Coffee arrived in endless quantities, cups piling up on every available surface. Yet despite the exhaustion, despite living in a fog of caffeine and tobacco smoke, he demanded perfection. From himself first, from his team without compromise. He'd brought many of these men together deliberately, selecting each one for specific talents. Thomas Dyer stood among the best, a cryptanalyst of remarkable gifts who would become essential to cracking JN25. He'd created entirely new procedures for harnessing IBM machines to process encrypted material, methods that would reshape code breaking forever. Alva Laswell possessed something rare, genuine fluency in Japanese, not just textbook knowledge. He'd studied in Tokyo, absorbing the subtleties buried in military communications, the hidden meanings that only someone who'd lived there could catch. Ham Wright worked shoulder to shoulder with Dyer on the most stubborn code groups, the ones that resisted all standard approaches. Joseph Finnegan brought mathematics to the puzzle. His insights into date-time groups would prove absolutely critical to everything that followed. Then came the enlisted men, dozens of them. Many had served as musicians aboard USS California before that ship went down at Pearl Harbor. They'd lost their ship, lost their futures. With nowhere else to go, they'd been assigned here, to this basement, to this work. What nobody initially understood was that musicians possessed something invaluable. The ability to read sheet music demanded pattern recognition, the same skill needed to spot recurring sequences in encrypted numbers. Rochefort recognized this connection. These men could see patterns others missed. The work itself was relentless. Messages arrived as endless strings of 5-digit numbers. By early 1942, the volume had exploded to hundreds daily. Each one demanded processing. The analysts stripped away additive values whenever they'd managed to recover them. Then came the hunt, searching for code groups that matched known meanings. But the vast majority remained mysteries, resistant and silent. They maintained card files tracking every instance of every code group. Context notes, sender information, recipient details. Everything got recorded. They searched for meanings through sheer repetition, through association, through educated guessing. When a particular code group kept appearing in messages discussing carrier movements, perhaps it meant carrier itself, or aircraft, or fuel, or ammunition. The analysts layered logic onto intuition, then applied painstaking cross-referencing to narrow possibilities down to something manageable. The IBM tabulating machines changed everything. These same devices that corporations used for accounting suddenly became weapons. Dyer had pioneered their application to cryptanalysis back in the 1930s, and now that experience mattered more than ever. Punch card operators transferred intercepted messages onto cards with precision. The machines sorted, counted, cross-referenced. They operated at speeds that would have taken human workers weeks to achieve. A single code group would trigger instant retrieval of every previous occurrence. Patterns emerged that would have remained hidden forever using manual methods. The machines clattered continuously, day and night, their rhythmic sounds becoming the soundtrack to the work. Many of the punch card operators came from the Navy clerical staff, women who became experts at preparing data for the analysts to examine. Through the winter and into early 1942, progress accumulated slowly. By Christmas, they'd recovered enough of the new additive system to begin reading message fragments. By February, new code groups got identified daily. April brought tangible results. Perhaps 20% of intercepted traffic became comprehensible, 1 word in 5. It seemed minimal until you understood military communications. Standard formats governed everything: position reports, fuel status, personnel assignments, operational orders. All predictable structures. When analysts knew the message type and could read 1 word in 5, they could reconstruct the rest. Logic filled the gaps. Then came Finnegan's breakthrough. The mathematician observed something in how date and time information appeared in messages. The Japanese encoded temporal data with extraordinary care, not wanting to expose when operations would occur. But patterns existed if you knew where to look. Finnegan discovered them. He developed what he called a 12 by 31 garble check, a mathematical test for verifying whether a suspected date-time code group made sense. By April, Station Hypo could determine dates embedded in messages, even when other portions remained opaque. This capability would become crucial within weeks. Through April and into early May, analysts noticed something troubling. References to AF kept appearing, unusual frequency, AF this, AF that. The Japanese used 2-letter designations for locations to maintain secrecy. Pearl Harbor was AH, the Aleutians were AO. But AF showed up constantly in traffic about troop concentrations, air units, supply vessels. The pattern suggested something major was being planned. Where was AF? Analysts in Washington theorized. Maybe the Aleutians, America's northernmost territory. Perhaps Port Moresby in New Guinea, or possibly even the American West Coast itself. Rochefort and his team held a different conviction. They believed AF represented Midway Island, a small American outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. But conviction wasn't proof. Admiral Nimitz needed evidence before committing his limited carriers to any particular strategy. Captain Wilfred Holmes, a submarine officer working at Station Hypo, proposed something audacious in mid-May. What if they forced the Japanese to confirm the answer through their own actions? Holmes suggested that Midway send an uncoded radio message mentioning water distillation equipment problems. Report that fresh water supplies were running dangerously low. Japanese intelligence monitored Midway constantly. They would intercept this message. And if AF really was Midway, Japanese communications would soon reference water shortages. Nimitz approved the gamble. On May 19th and 20th, Midway transmitted the message via underwater cable to Pearl Harbor, which then relayed it by radio using a low-level cipher already broken by Japanese cryptographers. The message described mechanical failures affecting the water distillation plant. Emergency fresh water shipments were requested. Station Hypo analysts waited. Within 2 days, on May 22nd, they intercepted something remarkable. After decryption, the message stated plainly, AF was short of water. Confirmation. The proof Rochefort needed. AF was definitely Midway. Now the analysts could pour everything into determining when the attack would come and what forces Japan would commit. Intelligence crystallized rapidly during May's final days. Station Hypo processed between 50 and 100 messages daily as Japanese units coordinated movements toward their objective. Each message added detail to the emerging picture. They identified the carriers participating: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. All four had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They tracked when various units departed Japanese bases. They plotted the approach route. They estimated invasion force composition. The picture grew complete. On May 27, 1942, the same morning USS Yorktown, battered from the Coral Sea, limped into Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton entered Admiral Nimitz's office. Their meetings happened every morning at 8 o'clock. Layton presented the daily intelligence assessment. But this morning felt different. Layton carried information so precise, so detailed, that Nimitz would later struggle to believe it. The Japanese would approach from the northwest, Layton explained. They would be spotted at bearing 325 degrees, approximately 175 miles from the island. The attack would begin at approximately 0700 hours on the morning of June 4th. 4 fleet carriers would deliver the striking power, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers. An invasion force with troop transports would follow. The Japanese plan involved carrier aircraft destroying American air defenses on Midway, then covering the landing of ground forces to seize the island. What made this briefing extraordinary wasn't merely the detail, it was Layton's absolute confidence. This wasn't guesswork. This wasn't tentative analysis based on incomplete information. This was intelligence derived from reading enemy communications. Rochefort and Station Hypo had penetrated JN25 deeply enough to read Japanese operational orders. They knew the enemy's plan as clearly as if they'd sat in Admiral Yamamoto's planning sessions. Nimitz absorbed this calmly. Questions followed: confidence levels, alternative interpretations. What if the intelligence proved wrong? Layton answered each one. He was confident. Station Hypo had verified their analysis repeatedly. Multiple messages from multiple sources all conveyed the same story. The Japanese were coming to Midway. They were coming on June 4th. Nimitz decided he would position his carriers northwest of Midway, where they could ambush the approaching Japanese force. The Japanese didn't know American codebreakers had cracked JN25. They expected surprise. Instead, surprise waited for them. But Nimitz faced an immediate problem. USS Yorktown, damaged at the Coral Sea, sat undergoing repairs in dry dock at Pearl Harbor. Navy inspectors estimated 3 months minimum before she could return to service. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Every carrier mattered for the coming battle. 1,400 civilian workers from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard descended upon Yorktown. They worked without stopping, cutting, welding, replacing damaged sections, patching holes. Across Oahu, rolling electrical blackouts provided power for welding equipment. 72 hours after Yorktown entered dry dock, she steamed out of Pearl Harbor with repair crews still working aboard, joining the task force assembling north of Midway. On June 3rd, American patrol aircraft spotted Japanese ships approaching from the west. June 4th dawned exactly as predicted. Radar operators on Midway detected aircraft coming from the northwest. At 0702 hours, just 2 minutes after Layton's predicted time, Japanese aircraft struck Midway. But American carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor as the Japanese expected. They were positioned northeast of Midway, waiting. When contact reports reached Nimitz that morning, he told Layton his prediction had missed by only 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles. One of the most accurate pieces of tactical intelligence in naval history. The battle raged from June 4th through June 7th. American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with aircraft being rearmed on deck. Within minutes, all 3 burned. They sank. Hiryu launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown, but American aircraft found and destroyed Hiryu that afternoon. For Yorktown and the destroyer USS Hamon, which was torpedoed while assisting the damaged carrier, the United States Navy sank all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Japan lost approximately 290 aircraft and 357 men. America lost 145 aircraft and 307 men. More significantly, Japan lost 4 experienced carrier crews. Pilots, mechanics, support personnel, irreplaceable. The Japanese Navy would never again achieve the striking power it possessed before Midway. The intelligence advantage extended beyond Midway. Station Hypo continued breaking JN25 throughout the war. Japanese commanders never realized their codes had been compromised. They kept using JN25, changing additives and codebooks periodically, but the cryptanalysts matched every change. The intelligence generated from JN25, codenamed Ultra, influenced every major American operation in the Pacific. When Japanese forces moved, American commanders knew beforehand. When convoys sailed, American submarines waited along their routes. When Japanese aircraft deployed to new bases, American bombers knew where to strike. April 1943 brought one of Ultra-intelligence's most dramatic applications. American cryptanalysts decoded a message revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The message provided exact route and timing. Admiral Nimitz ordered an interception. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal flew 500 miles to intercept Yamamoto's transport. They arrived exactly on time, exactly on course, and shot down both Japanese aircraft. Yamamoto died in the Bougainville jungle. Operation Vengeance succeeded because American cryptanalysts could read the Japanese Navy's most secure communications. Intelligence had changed the course of war. This triumph nearly became catastrophe 1 month after Midway. On June 7, 1942, the Chicago Tribune published a front-page story by reporter Stanley Johnston. The headline read, "Navy had word of Jap plan to strike at sea." The article strongly suggested the Navy possessed advanced knowledge of the Japanese battle plan through code breaking. Johnston had been aboard USS Lexington during the Coral Sea battle and had seen classified dispatches. His article dangerously approached revealing that American cryptanalysts could read Japanese codes. President Roosevelt and Navy Secretary Frank Knox were enraged. They demanded Johnston be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. A grand jury investigated but declined to indict. The Japanese either didn't see the article or failed to grasp its meaning. They continued using JN25, never suspecting compromise. Joseph Rochefort received no recognition for his achievement. In October 1942, despite having provided the intelligence enabling Midway's victory, Rochefort was relieved from Station Hypo and reassigned to oversee construction of floating dry docks on the West Coast. In Washington, the machinery of bureaucratic power ground forward, driven by rivalries that had nothing to do with victory. Admiral Ernest King's Intelligence Division, under the command of Captain John Redman and his brother Commander Joseph Redman, viewed Rochefort's direct pipeline to Nimitz with deep resentment. They believed all intelligence should flow through Washington, subject to their oversight and approval. Beyond the organizational turf war, they also questioned some of Rochefort's interpretations and conclusions about Japanese movements. When Admiral Nimitz put forward Rochefort's name for the Distinguished Service Medal in the immediate aftermath of Midway, King blocked it. Rochefort would fade into obscurity for the rest of the war, his achievements known only to a handful of people who understood what he had actually accomplished. Those who had worked alongside him carried the weight of witnessing this injustice. Edwin Layton, who stood with Rochefort through those pivotal months, later recorded in his own memoirs that this treatment represented one of the war's greatest wrongs. Admiral Nimitz himself shared this view and never forgot the slight. After the war ended, Nimitz made efforts to secure proper recognition for his brilliant intelligence officer, but the bureaucratic machinery that had once opposed him continued to resist. Then, in 1957, Station Hypo finally received a Presidential Unit citation honoring its contributions before and during the Midway battle. Rochefort was there to witness the ceremony held in Washington, though it was the organization that received honor, not him personally. Recognition existed, yes, but it fell short of what justice demanded. On July 20, 1976, in Torrance, California, Rochefort passed away at the age of 76. He died without ever receiving the individual honor his work deserved. A full decade after his death, the Navy institution finally confronted its historical error. On May 30, 1986, President Ronald Reagan held a White House ceremony to posthumously present the Distinguished Service Medal to Captain Rochefort. His children stood present, alongside senior defense officials and Vice President George Bush. Vice Admiral William Studeman, then director of the National Security Agency, also attended. The citation highlighted Rochefort's decisive role in America's triumph at Midway, stating that his brilliant, unceasing labor had been the essential ingredient in the victory. This recognition arrived tragically late, but it reclaimed Rochefort's place in the historical record. Today, the Navy's intelligence school at Dam Neck, Virginia, stands as a monument to his legacy. Future intelligence officers will learn about the man who unlocked Japan's secrets and altered the Pacific War's trajectory. Yet Rochefort's friend and colleague Edwin Layton, who briefed Admiral Nimitz on May 27, 1942, spent decades in similar obscurity. Throughout the Pacific War, Layton served as Nimitz's chief intelligence advisor, delivering the assessments that determined every significant operation. After the war, he retired holding the rank of Rear Admiral, but remained bound by secrecy about the code-breaking work. Station Hypo's operations stayed classified for many years. The story could only emerge once the National Security Agency began declassifying World War II signals intelligence records in the 1970s. Layton then co-authored And I Was There, Pearl Harbor and Midway, Breaking the Secrets, published in 1985 shortly after his passing. This work provided the first comprehensive public account of how American cryptanalysts had penetrated JN25 and made possible the victory at Midway. Lawrence Safard, the pioneer who founded the Navy's code-breaking program back in 1924 and brought talented men into the fold, faced similar tribulation from Washington politics. In February 1942, precisely when the assault on JN25 was at its most intense, Safard was removed from leadership and shelved for the remainder of the war. The same internal power struggles that would later topple Rochefort had already claimed Safard as their first victim. He concluded his career as a captain and died in 1973, his foundational work in American intelligence largely unknown to ordinary citizens. Recognition finally came in 1999 when the National Security Agency enshrined Safard in its Hall of Honor, acknowledging him as the architect upon whose principles all subsequent Navy cryptanalysis rested. The personal sacrifices made by these codebreakers deserve remembering. These individuals labored in darkness, unable even to speak with their own families about their work. Triumphs had to remain unshared. Frustrations went unexpressed. When peace returned, regulations kept them silent about their achievements for many additional years. Classified documents stayed locked away through the 1970s and 1980s. By the time the truth could be told publicly, numerous participants had already passed away. Rochefort himself died in 1976, just as the initial books examining the Midway code-breaking breakthrough were reaching readers. He never witnessed the full public recognition his efforts had earned. The lessons developed at Station Hypo shaped the modern intelligence community. When the National Security Agency was established in 1952, it incorporated many operational practices that Hypo had pioneered. The emphasis on cooperation between separate collection and analysis departments, employing technology to handle massive data volumes, recognizing the value of language expertise and cultural understanding, granting intelligence analysts direct access to operational commanders. These concepts, validated through Pacific War experience, became cornerstones of American signals intelligence. The historical record also demonstrates how individual brilliance matters in intelligence operations. Rochefort brought intuitive grasp of Japanese strategic thinking. Finnegan achieved his breakthrough in date-time encryption. Dyer supplied mathematical genius. Laswell contributed language mastery. Holmes devised his clever ruse. Layton possessed the ability to translate intelligence into language that commanders could act upon. Each contribution proved indispensable, No single person could have cracked JN25. The work demanded a specialized team where each member brought particular expertise, yet they also required leadership that could effectively channel those distinct talents. Rochefort fostered an environment where eccentric, brilliant minds flourished. He shielded them from administrative obstacles, supplied them with necessary resources, and placed trust in their professional judgment. The equipment at Station Hypo, primitive compared to today's standards, represented technological marvels for the period. IBM punch card machines achieved data processing speeds that seemed almost miraculous in 1942, though they proved loud, finicky, and demanded constant attention. The basement chamber where they operated thrummed with the staccato sound of card readers and reeked of machine lubricant. Critical moments often arrived just when the machines decided to fail. Enlisted personnel became ingenious at repairs, keeping the temperamental equipment functioning through creativity and sheer perseverance. These early encounters with automated computation influenced post-war computer development. Several Hypo veterans later pursued careers in the emerging computer field. The contribution of Japanese language knowledge cannot be minimized. Even after identifying a code group, messages required translation. Japanese itself presents challenges with its multiple registers of formality and tendency toward indirect expression. Military Japanese employed its own distinctive vocabulary and syntax. Station Hypo's translators needed more than linguistic competence. They had to grasp context, comprehend cultural frameworks, and understand how Japanese naval officers communicated their thoughts. Rochefort's years spent in Tokyo proved enormously valuable for this work. He grasped the Japanese military mindset. He read hidden meanings in subtle linguistic choices. The traffic analysis dimension was equally significant to the decryption effort. When messages resisted decryption, communication patterns still yielded valuable insights. Which command centers contacted which other command centers? How regularly? At what hours? A surge in traffic between combined fleet headquarters and carrier divisions signaled that operations were being coordinated. Radio silence from particular units suggested they were departing, probably steering toward their objective. Alterations in call designations or transmission frequencies frequently preceded major operations. Hypo's traffic specialists catalogued all these variations, assembling a comprehensive understanding of Japanese naval structure and operational rhythms. Human involvement in this accomplishment extended well beyond the analytical core. The radio operators stationed at intercept facilities scattered across the Pacific realm from Hawaii through Australia to Alaska worked amid harsh circumstances to capture Japanese transmissions. Radio waves traveled unpredictably through the atmospheric layers. Weather patterns caused transmission strength to waver. Japanese operators sometimes broadcast at accelerated speeds, rendering exact copying extremely challenging. American listeners needed acute hearing capacity and unlimited perseverance. They endured hours of monotonous monitoring, recording number sequences that conveyed nothing to them personally, trusting that analysts elsewhere would convert those sequences into actionable intelligence. The security measures guarding this operation were extraordinary in scope. Remarkably few individuals possessed knowledge that JN25 had been compromised. Nimitz knew, his principal officers knew, the hypo-analysts knew. The broader Pacific Fleet remained ignorant that America could intercept and read Japanese messages. Preserving secrecy mattered enormously. Should the Japanese learn their codes were exposed, they would overhaul their entire communication system overnight. Many weeks of analytical effort would evaporate. This created complicated dilemmas. Intelligence might expose Japanese submarines positioned in ambush positions along specific shipping lanes. Yet commanders couldn't simply reroute convoys without potentially revealing the information source. Solution required creativity. Aircraft would be dispatched to ostensibly locate the submarines through routine patrol, providing plausible justification for route changes. Midway's conclusion spurred escalation of the code-breaking enterprise. Additional analysts joined the effort. More intercept stations came online. IBM equipment underwent enhancement. By autumn 1942, the Navy was decrypting thousands of Japanese messages weekly. This intelligence reached commanders through an organization called Ultra. terminology borrowed from British practice for intelligence extracted from broken codes. Ultra reports traveled to field commanders under rigorous security conditions. Special paper was employed that dissolved if vessels sank. Radio discussion of the intelligence was absolutely prohibited. Military actions based on ultra information required concealment to prevent enemies from deducing its source. This intelligence directed every major American Pacific operation through war's conclusion. When American forces invaded Guadalcanal in August 1942, Ultra revealed the timing and magnitude of Japanese reinforcement efforts. American naval forces could therefore intercept and annihilate several Tokyo Express supply runs, transporting soldiers and cargo to the island. At the Philippine Sea Battle in June 1944, Ultra provided Admiral Raymond Spruance with precise knowledge of Japanese carrier positions and aircraft capacity. This intelligence enabled the devastation of Japanese naval aviation, what American pilots famously called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Intelligence possessed significance extending beyond immediate battle outcomes. From intercepted communications concerning fuel limitations, transport destruction, and supply exhaustion, American strategists grasped that Japan's economic war machine was deteriorating. This realization guided decisions about invasion targets and which positions to leave untouched. It enabled the submarine offensive that systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping. By 1944, American submarines armed with ultra-information were destroying Japanese commercial vessels faster than replacement capacity existed. Distant island garrisons suffered starvation from supply interruptions. The homeland faced depleting reserves of petroleum, rubber, and other vital materials. Though unaware of the information source, Japanese commanders experienced psychological consequences from these reverses. They grew to suspect American intelligence possessed almost supernatural precision. How otherwise could Americans consistently arrive at decisive moments? How could they forecast every Japanese maneuver? This suspicion bred paranoia and doubt. Japanese military leaders grew hesitant to authorize major operations, fearing Americans would somehow anticipate their intentions. This cautious approach, combined with the tangible military setbacks Japan had sustained, meant that following Midway, Japan forfeited strategic direction. The cryptanalysis campaign also influenced Allied planning across the global conflict. Pacific intelligence reached British and American teams operating in European theaters. Methods developed by Station Hypo influenced cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, fighting German Enigma systems. Cross-fertilization of techniques, approaches, and instruments occurred. Knowledge accumulated through JN25 penetration shaped subsequent cryptanalysis activities that grew vital throughout Cold War confrontation. One might quantify signals intelligence's influence on the Pacific War through multiple measures. Hundreds of Japanese ships fell victim to attacks guided by ultra-intelligence. The quantity of American personnel spared from ambushes and casualties through advance warning remains impossible to calculate precisely. Strategic advantage derived from comprehending Japanese objectives and resources shortened hostilities by months, conceivably years. Certain specialists propose that minus the intelligence transformation at Midway, Pacific conflict might have extended to 1946 or even 1947, with corresponding increases in casualties across both nations. Yet perhaps the most profound consequence was psychological orientation. Following Midway, American commanders operated from positions of confidence. They anticipated that Japanese operations would seldom bring surprises. They structured campaigns with the knowledge that intelligence would caution them about Japanese responses. This assurance spread throughout every command level. American sailors and pilots entered engagements cognizant that their leaders possessed reliable information regarding conditions they would encounter. This awareness strengthened resolve and combat performance. Japanese forces conversely battled amid mounting confusion. Plans failed repeatedly without comprehensible explanation. Their intelligence apparatus couldn't achieve equivalent penetration of American systems that Americans had accomplished against them. This asymmetry in intelligence capabilities matched any material factor in determining Japan's ultimate collapse. Station Hypo's narrative and JN25's penetration ultimately address information's significance in contemporary warfare. The account demonstrates that conflicts arise through triumph, not solely via courageous combatants and sophisticated armaments, but through basement mathematicians, translators decoding intercepted words, linguists extracting meaning from foreign language messages. Nimitz's determination to depend on Rochefort's findings and risk his carriers founded upon decrypted communications represents perhaps the most remarkable demonstration of command bravery recorded in military chronicles. He gambled everything, depending on intelligence that numerous colleagues regarded as implausibly precise. History vindicated his decision through the Pacific War's greatest American naval success. The message for subsequent military and intelligence professionals emerges with clarity. Intelligence constitutes something more than an accompaniment to military campaigns. It functions as something fundamental. A commander possessing dependable intelligence accomplishes decisions unavailable to commanders without such advantage. Investments in intelligence acquisition and examination generate returns exceeding expenditures many times over. A few hundred station hypo personnel equipped with their mechanical processors, linguistic abilities, and mathematical talents supplied greater contribution to Pacific fighting than numerous combat formations of considerably larger scope. Guns didn't accompany their labor. Information constituted their instrument. Information channeled through commanders with the judgment and courage to implement it transformed into warfare's ultimate resource. The historical memory of these individuals showcases intelligence's potential, the value of foresight, and the valor of commanders prepared to act upon intelligence despite what conventional thinking prescribed. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Nimitz discovered he possessed access to every Japanese communication. 7 days afterward, he weaponized that access to secure triumph at Midway. The Pacific conflict persisted for 3 additional years, yet Midway fundamentally altered the trajectory. Japan's naval strength lay shattered. America's productive capacity would determine the outcome. Everything originated with a modest collection of intelligence specialists operating in a basement in Hawaii. Individuals who accomplished the thought impossible. Individuals who granted their commander the capacity to perceive what lay ahead.